Podcast 5 Learning. Podcast 5 Goals, Definition of Learning, Analytical versus Emotional, Theories and Applications, and an assignment. There are two major types of learning, analytical and emotional, or cognitive and non-cognitive, or the many other of the dichotomies that we described in previous podcasts. In this classic text by Gagne, he describes 9 steps in the learning process that includes both analytical and emotional intelligences. We may all be familiar with the concept of analytical intelligence because that's typically what is measured on an IQ test. In the late 1980s, Daniel Goleman introduced his book on emotional intelligence, describing that our emotions and our subconscious need to be tapped into. When we have both analytical intelligence and emotional intelligence operating optimally, then we have parallel processing in the brain, as discussed in previous podcasts. Then, when we have parallel processing, you're able to extract from our environment, whether it's internal or external, exponential amounts of information as opposed to being a serial information processor. Here are other classic books on development of intelligence and learning, which in retrospect include both analytical and emotional intelligence. Of course, starting with children at a young age, the intelligence is primarily emotional, not cognitive, and then they gradually develop analytical intelligence. The trick or secret, you may recall, is the ability of the child to gradually go from emotional to analytical intelligence without losing the emotional intelligence that they have learned during the formative years. They should be able to integrate the emotional intelligence with the newly developed analytical intelligence to achieve parallel processing. Other theories of intelligence and learning include Skinner's work on operant conditioning. In a more recent development in learning and thinking, cognitive behavior therapy, which is a combination of the conditioning of Skinner with cognitive learning theories of later psychologists and educators, has become popular. Prior to the 1970s, the inherited theory of intelligence was favored over the learned environmental factors involved in intelligence. In the 1970s, Leon Kamen published his book that documented that Burke's work, this is Sir Cyril Burke in England, was fraudulent and is used in most psychology textbooks today as a classic example of fraudulent research. What Kamen found was that Burke claimed that identical twins who were reared apart had the same IQs. What was later found out and reported in Kamen's book was that the children were cousins, and in England it was typical for sisters to live in side-by-side houses. So in fact the children were raised together. There were other problems with the studies as well, and if you're interested you can get a copy of Kamen's book. Currently it is generally accepted that intelligence and our ability to learn is a dynamic combination of both hereditary and environmental factors. This graph shows many types of intelligence that should be integrated together to give us the maximum amount of learning ability and the maximum amount of using our intellectual potential. We have visceral, rational, emotional, logical, insight, creative, intuitive, imaginative, and analytical. Another graphic shows parallel processing of central and peripheral, cognitive and non-cognitive learning together and its relationship to both connections to the eye and to the brain, because most of our learning, it's been reported that 80% of our brain activity is related to our vision. As an assignment, listen to a news report and read a book at the same time. Can you do it? Was the listening comprehension better than the visual, than the reading? And what happens when you do this? You get distracted, lose your concentration. If you have any questions, you can send them to me at the email address here, and I'll be happy to address them.